Most people think of the time of Jesus as a purely spiritual setting. It's a world of sandals, sermons, miracles, and morality plays, staged in a distant, religious past. But for the people actually living in first-century Judea, daily life was not defined by theology. It was defined by money or, more precisely, by the systematic lack of it. The world that the historical figure of Jesus was born into was shaped by one of the most unequal and extractive economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Part 1. The Roman Extraction Machine. At the beginning of the 1st century, the land of Judea sat uneasily inside the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was, first and foremost, the most sophisticated extraction machine the world had yet produced. Rome didn't conquer territories to civilize or uplift them in the modern sense. It conquered them to fund the center. The entire imperial project was designed to move wealth from the periphery to the core. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, timber from Syria, and labor from everywhere, all of it flowed from the edges of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea, a small but strategically located province, was one of those edges. This fact is critical because Judea was not an inherently wealthy land. It was largely rural and agricultural. Its output of wheat, barley, olives, and grapes fragile and dependent on seasonal rains. It had no major mineral resources to export. Its primary value to Rome was as a land bridge and a source of steady, if not spectacular, revenue. Rome's mandate to its governors, like Pontius Pilate, and its client kings, like the family of Herod, was brutally simple: maintain order and ensure that revenue kept flowing, improving local living standards, investing in the well-being of the populace. These were not part of the job description. The goal was stability and extraction, a formula that defined life for millions across the empire. Part 2. A system of crushing taxation. The backbone of this entire system was taxation. But this was not taxation as we know it, where levies are placed on profit, income, or capital gains. In 1st century Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. You paid because you existed, and because the land you worked ultimately belonged, in Roman eyes, to the empire. First came the direct Roman taxes, the most hated symbols of foreign domination. There was the tributum soli, a land tax levied on agricultural output. This was often paid in kind, a set percentage of a farmer's crop of grain, wine, or oil, perhaps around 10% of the yield, had to be handed over. Then there was the tributum capitis, a head tax paid in coin. This was a tax for simply being alive, typically 1 denarius per year for every adult male, which was the equivalent of a full day's wage for a common laborer. For a family struggling at the edge of subsistence, this was a significant burden. On top of these direct Roman levies were endless local taxes and tolls. Client rulers like Herod Antipas imposed their own taxes to fund their lavish building projects and maintain their courts. And then there were the indirect taxes, the vectigalia, which were duties on goods moving along roads, through city gates, or into markets. Every transaction, every movement of goods, was an opportunity for another small extraction. Finally, religious taxes were layered on top of these secular ones. Every adult Jewish man was expected to pay tithes and offerings to support the Jerusalem temple and its priesthood. While estimates vary, the combined burden from Roman, local, and religious obligations could consume upwards of 30 to 40%, and in some estimates, even more of a peasant family's total production. In this economy, there was no buffer. A single bad harvest caused by drought or blight didn't just mean a tough year. It meant catastrophe. Part 3. The collaborators and the debt spiral. This is where the system's design becomes particularly uncomfortable. Rome didn't always collect these taxes with its own legions of bureaucrats. It often outsourced the work, creating a class of middlemen who bore the brunt of popular hatred. In some provinces, the right to collect taxes was sold at auction to private corporations called the publicani. These firms would pay the state a lump sum upfront, and then were free to collect as much as they could from the province, pocketing the difference. This practice was notorious for its corruption and extortion. In Judea by the 1st century, direct collection by the publicani was less common, but the principle of outsourcing remained. Tax collection was often managed by local elites, and their agents, the figures who appear in the Gospels simply as tax collectors. These men were often Jews collecting Roman taxes from their own people, a role that branded them as collaborators and traitors. Their methods often justified the deep resentment directed at them, since their profit frequently came from collecting more than the officially assessed amount. Abuse wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the core incentive. They were the human face of Roman oppression, and they became social outcasts for it. If you couldn't pay your taxes, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere in the ancient world, and unlike modern debt, it came with few, if any, safety valves. There was no concept of bankruptcy protection or compassionate restructuring. Jewish law technically prohibited charging interest, usury, on loans made to fellow Jews. But these religious rules were often cleverly circumvented by the powerful, especially for loans of seed for the next planting or food to survive the winter. Here's how the downward spiral typically worked. A farming family has a bad harvest. The Roman tax assessment, however, is fixed and still due. To pay it, the farmer borrows from a wealthy local lender, often a large landowner or someone connected to the urban elite. The interest begins to accrue immediately. The next year, another poor harvest or a family illness means he can't repay the loan. This time, the lender demands collateral, the farmer's ancestral land, the plot his family had worked for generations. After another season, the inevitable happens. The debt is called in, and the land is seized. This wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was a structural feature of the economy. This process fueled a steady, relentless consolidation of land into the hands of a small, wealthy elite. These elites assembled vast commercial estates, or latifundia, which were often dedicated to producing cash crops like wine and olive oil for export. The former landowner might, if he was lucky, become a tenant farmer on the very property that used to be his. More likely, he would be pushed into the growing class of day laborers, men who would stand in the village marketplace each morning, hoping to be hired for a single day's wage. The economy didn't just produce poverty, it reproduced it, generation after generation. There was no state safety net, no unemployment insurance, no welfare, no social security. The family and the village were the only buffers, and when too many people fell into crisis at once, the system offered nothing. Debt wasn't just a financial state, it was a social and spiritual crisis. Losing one's land meant losing security, identity, and your family's heritage and future. This is the world Jesus was born into, and it is vital to say this clearly. The vast majority of people were not poor because they were lazy or immoral. They were poor because the system was designed to function on the back of a large, dependent, and desperate labor class. That constant, grinding pressure produced a society that was not quiet. It was volatile and simmering with resentment. Part 4. The Temple as a Financial Powerhouse. To understand why this economy felt so inescapable, you have to look at the one institution many believed was supposed to protect them: the Jerusalem Temple. Most people today imagine the temple as a purely religious site, a house of prayer and sacrifice. But in economic terms, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. It didn't just shape belief. It moved, stored, and legitimized vast sums of money. On one level, it was the sacred center of Judaism. On another, it functioned as a national treasury, a central bank, and a tax authority all in one. These roles were inseparable. Every adult Jewish man across the world was required by religious law to pay an annual temple tax of a half shekel. This was equivalent to about 2 days' wages for a common laborer, making it a substantial financial obligation for the poor. And this wasn't a voluntary donation. It was an enforced tax, crucial for funding the temple's elaborate operations, from its massive priesthood to its daily sacrifices. The financial machinery around this tax was complex. The tax had to be paid in a specific, high-purity silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, minted in the Phoenician city of Tyre. Common Roman coins, which bore the graven image of the emperor, were deemed impure for this sacred payment. This rule created an entire industry. Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem for the great festivals, carrying Roman denarii or other local currencies, had to exchange their money for the approved Tyrian shekels. This was handled by official money changers, who set up tables in the temple's vast outer court. They didn't provide this service for free. Exchange fees and commissions were built into the system. Ironically, the accepted Tyrian shekel itself bore the image of the Phoenician deity Melkar, a pagan god. But rabbinic authorities prioritized the coin's stable and high silver content, around 94% purity, over the prohibition against graven images, a practical compromise that ensured the temple's treasury was not shortchanged. Beyond the tax, the temple was the center of the sacrificial economy. Pilgrims were required to offer sacrifices, but bringing an animal from a distant home like Galilee or Egypt was impractical. Instead, they bought officially approved animals, doves, sheep, oxen from vendors operating in or near the temple grounds. This created a captive market, and evidence suggests that these animals were often sold at inflated prices. The institution that preached holiness and forgiveness also operated a system that could reinforce debt and inequality. Access to God required payment, purity required an offering, and sacrifice required money. Here we arrive at the central tension. The temple elite, the powerful high priestly families like the House of Annas, were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. The high priest was often appointed with the approval of the Roman governor. This meant the very institution that held the highest moral authority over the Jewish people also benefited from and collaborated with the same logic of extraction that impoverished them. People noticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward the temple authorities was widespread, not because people were losing their faith, but because they saw profound hypocrisy at the heart of their religious life. Part 5. A message of economic disruption. This is why Jesus' message was so radical and disruptive. He was not speaking in a spiritual vacuum. When he taught his disciples to pray, "Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors," his audience wasn't just hearing a quaint metaphor for sin. In a world defined by inescapable, crushing financial debt, they were hearing a direct call for economic release, echoing the Old Testament's commands for a jubilee year of debt cancellation. His parables, which we often read as simple moral stories, were brutally realistic depictions of daily economic life. The parable of the workers in the vineyard speaks directly to the anxieties of day laborers hoping for a fair wage. The parable of the unforgiving servant, who is forgiven a massive debt by his king, but then refuses to forgive a tiny debt owed to him, was a sharp critique of the wealthy creditor class. Parables of debtors thrown in prison, of tenant farmers in conflict with landowners, and of rich fools storing up earthly treasure were not abstract fables. They were drawn directly from the lived experience of his listeners. When he was challenged on the legitimacy of paying taxes to Rome, his famous response, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's," was not a simple endorsement of the status quo. In a world where God's land was producing crops that were being seized by Caesar, this was a profoundly ambiguous and challenging statement. It forced his listeners to ask a dangerous question. What truly belongs to Caesar, and what belongs to God? Where does the emperor's authority end and God's begin? And then there was the act that likely sealed his fate, the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and the stalls of the dove sellers, it was far more than an outburst of religious piety. It was a direct, physical act of economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer or sacrifice itself. He was attacking the very machinery that monetized access to the sacred and profited from the poor. He called it a den of robbers, a phrase that resonated deeply with a populace that felt robbed, not only by Roman tax collectors, but by the very religious leaders who claimed to speak for God. This act crossed a critical line. Rome could tolerate itinerant preachers, prophets, and critics. What it could not and would not tolerate was a threat to public order and economic stability. For the temple authorities, Jesus was no longer just a Galilean preacher with a following. He was actively disrupting the economic and political equilibrium that guaranteed their wealth and power. From their perspective, the conflict was not primarily theological. It was about order. He was bad for business, and the system could not tolerate a narrative that questioned whether the suffering it produced was truly necessary or just. What followed wasn't the immediate collapse of the system, but its violent escalation. Within a single generation, the simmering resentments in Judea exploded into a full-scale revolt against Rome, a war fueled by decades of economic despair, crushing debt, and landlessness. By 70 C, Roman legions besieged and utterly destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, carting its treasury off to Rome to fund new imperial monuments. Rome didn't just suppress dissent, it dismantled the entire infrastructure of Judean economic and religious life. In the short term, Rome won decisively, but winning control of territory is not the same as winning control of meaning. What Jesus had challenged was not Rome's military might or its ability to extract wealth. He had challenged the moral logic that made that extraction feel inevitable and even divinely sanctioned. By undermining the pervasive idea that debt and poverty were signs of personal moral failure, and by treating the poor as central to his message rather than as defective outcasts, he destabilized something that empires depend on just as much as legions: legitimacy. After the temple fell, the critique did not vanish. Small communities began to form around a radically different economic logic, one of shared resources, mutual aid, and loyalty based on shared belief rather than social status or wealth. The book of Acts describes early believers in Jerusalem pooling their possessions and distributing them to anyone as he had need. This was not an enforced communism, but a voluntary counterculture, a lived alternative to the extractive Roman model. Rome had crushed the armed rebellion, but this kind of challenge, an idea, a new way of organizing community, was much harder to extinguish because it didn't require territory or treasuries. It moved with people. The economy of Jesus' time reveals something deeply uncomfortable and timeless. Systems don't collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the narratives that justify them stop working. Economic systems that are wrapped in the language of morality, necessity, and divine will are extraordinarily durable. They can survive immense hardship, widespread resentment, and even violent rebellion. What they cannot survive is widespread disbelief. The moment a critical mass of people stops accepting that their suffering is an inevitable part of the natural order, history doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with force, but with the stories it tells about itself, it becomes much harder to believe that those stories are accidental. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.